Okay. Well, good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fourth International Colloquium on African Studies, organized by the University Program of African and Asian Studies. As I said, I'm very happy to welcome you here and to welcome our guest speaker, Howard Stein, that comes from the US to give this keynote lecture. And I think this, I'm very happy personally to be here once again, organizing this event, the fourth one. And I think that African studies here in Latin America are getting stronger and stronger. And even though that this room is a little bit empty today, it's because of the time, I think also. But I think that there's a growing interest, and a growing interest also in assessing the place of Africa, African countries, African societies, African dynamics in the international system. We are used to conceive Africa as a peripheral actor in the international system, and we should shift from that point of view to placing it in the center of our analysis, so that disciplines such as international relations can grow from another perspective, of analytical perspective. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker of this morning. So Howard Stein is a professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. He is a development economist educated in Canada, the US, and the UK. He has published more than a dozen books and edited collections and more than 150 journal articles, book chapters, and reviews. He has held various academic appointments at places like the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Hitotsubashi University at Japan, Sussex University at the UK, Trinity College in Ireland, University of Lisbon in Portugal, and University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He has undertaken research in a variety of African countries on topics like foreign aid, World Bank and IMF lending, finance and banking, neoliberalism, the methodology of randomized controlled trials, health and gender, climate change, industrial policy, export processing zones, agricultural policy, African overpayment on sovereign bond issues, poverty and rural property right transformation, income inequality, Chinese economic relations, and the institutionalization of neoclassical economics. So you can see that his research covers a lot of topics. So I lend you the floor is yours, Dr. Stein, and we are very pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. It just means that I get bored easily on a subject, so I move to another one. Basically, I want to really thank the Studio Cebre Asia Africa. I'm sorry I don't speak much Spanish, Piquito. But I also want to thank Alicia Guéron, who's an old friend. We've been on panels many together. She should be up here with me, I think, and knows as much about this subject as I do. And also Vania de la Vega, who the secretary who arranged everything and put a lot of good work into it. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's taken me a long time to get to Mexico City, my first visit, and it's a beautiful campus, it looks like, having driven through quickly to get here. Today I'm going to cover, I want to very much focus on the issue of Africa and financial flows, because it's so central, as I'll explain, but I can't sort of take this moment to look at this moment, to examine these extraordinary Trump's tariffs that have been placed in the world with huge consequences to sub-Saharan Africa, Africa in general. And so I'm going to start by introduction, basically talking very briefly about multipolarity, which is anybody who's a linguist knows it's a bit of an oxymoron, because multipolarity, basically, polarity itself is always comes in pairs, opposed but equivalent. Polarity, by definition, is the state of having two opposite or contradictory tendencies or opinions. But we know in popular jargon that's come to discuss the issues of power and nodes of power and concentration, we have this focus on the unipolarity, domination of the world by one power, bipolarity, the two major powers, and then multipolarity. A world in its formal definition characterized by existence of multiple centers of power without one particular power being dominant. But in the real world, of course, polarity is a continuum. And there's enormous variabilities of the degree of power among different players, and a great deal of asymmetric power relationships that are always embedded within each of these poles within the world. And there's always, within this context, the duality of both domination and subordination. I'll talk about that in the financial field, which is so crucial. To complicate things even further, there are all sorts of different spheres of domination. It covers military, production, trade, wealth, income, science, technology, education, culture, language, political systems, and of course, to complicate things even more significant than that, it also means interaction of all these spheres. So it's a kind of complicated world. If we took at the closest thing to unipolarity, we'd really have to talk about United States and the military, because the United States basically spends 40% of the world's global expenditures on the military, and it's equal to the next 9 countries' expenditures on the military. But we know at this moment, given the enormous disruption in the world by the election of Donald Trump, that might change because of the kind of meandering and often menacing proclamations that are coming from our dear new president. The R, I would argue, and I'm going to spend a little time about this by introduction before I actually get into the issue of financial flows, they're clearly self-destructive. And there's no doubt that what he is doing will undermine the degree of domination of the United States in the areas of science and technology, education, value chain production, international trade, aid, and finance, which will strengthen multipolarity. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the Trump regime. I can't, though, entirely ignore it without a few editorial comments at this moment. But basically, and it's important in the context of Africa, Trump really is abandoning what I'd call what we used to be a fairly successful combination for American hegemonic presence in the world, which was a combination of soft and hard power. And he's now moving much more systematically into the realm of coercion. And what we see increasingly, even affecting my university, is these kind of punitive measures of the apparatus of the state, which really includes billions of dollars of curtailment, fiscal expenditures, as well as behavioral related contingencies trying to alter behavior with threats. And what is nothing but pure, often recorded Gestapo-like nabbing and imprisonment of an expulsion of legal and illegal residents, often with the complete suspension of habeas corpus, the absolute abrogation of a list of constitutional rights, including birthright citizenship, unilateral imposition of tariffs, the threat of overt imperialistic style, military interventions with the potential seizure of sovereign territories. His operational budget, I'm one of the few people that actually downloaded and read this 900-page document, and knew what was coming. So there's actually not a lot that's surprising me because it's quite a bit of his blueprint. I probably killed 2 or 3 trees when I did this, but I can't read 900 pages online, basically. And also he's inspired by somewhat distorted images of fascist dictatorships. I don't want to go into the details of that. I would argue that his strategy of violence and rapid institutional transformation is very much in the spirit of the very famous book by Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine. And so what we have is really a systematic effort at disorientation, dysfunction, the creation of the imbalance of the opposition. And it's really aimed at trying to generate a tabula rasa, which is filled with a new set of authoritarian institutions, or in the Veblennian terms of which Alicia and I very much adhere to in economic theory, habits of thought, commonly generally men and women, aimed at really reconstituting the institutional basis of society, the polity, and the economy. Basically, it's an attempt to kind of set up this new hierarchical structures, both domestically and globally. Much of the oligarchy is already in place in the United States. That's another discussion. But it also is setting in motion, I would argue, what's the end purpose? Well, there are many, but also it's particularly kind of David Harvey style accumulation by dispossession, which is an attempt to actually demonstrate the lack of credibility and the lack of functionality of the state, aimed at then saying, look, the public sector doesn't work, let's hire it over to the private sector. And there's been discussions of privatizing huge trillions of dollars of Social Security into the stock market. Now, whether Trump and his minions will be successful is uncertain. What is certain is that what he has done on multiple planes will have a big impact on polarity in the world. It will generate multipolarity. Now, what about Africa? I'm here to talk about Africa. Okay. There's little doubt that the imposition of this rather insane set of 10 to 50% tariffs on African countries, the end of AGOA really is undercutting the soft power influence of the United States in Africa, and will push Africa towards increasing relationships economically and otherwise with other regions, helping to speed up multipolarity. We look at the area of tariffs. So we can see poor Lesotho, one of the poorest countries in the world, a 50% tariff on their exports, all the way through South Africa, 30%, of tariffs, basically. You can see that Lesotho relies significantly on exports to the United States. It will have a huge impact on the economy. Now, I can, as an economist, not spend a little time looking at the basis of how they came up with this stuff. Now, Trump basically claimed that tariffs are a reaction to the tariffs on the protection of these other countries. It's a complete fabrication, like the other tens of thousands of things that come out of his mouth. Basically, the formula simply is used as a trade deficit divided by imports to the United States times 0.5. Where does it come from? It basically comes from the trade balance to zero, the change arising from a change of tariffs, basically, is simply a product of the trade deficit, divided by the elasticity of import prices with respect to tariffs, phi, which is assumed to be 0.25, and the price elasticity of import demand, which is set epsilon at 4. Trump then they then divide the number by 2, partly because if you read the brief, as I did a couple of days ago, there's a possibility long-term price elasticity imports is maybe 2 rather than 4, in part because they say we're being nice, we're not being so hard. Basically, the numbers are nonsense. The formula is nonsense for so many different reasons, even for mainstream economists, which I'm not. All elasticities vary by country and sector. So the idea that you come up with a single number is completely ludicrous. They assume, actually, in the stated, assume that there's offsetting exchange rate and economic effects are small enough to be ignored. That's crazy, basically, because in a world of supply chain and floating exchange rates, you're going to have huge adjustments. That's not even, so it's entirely assumed away. They make a mistake, which I would probably flunk my first-year economics students. I don't teach economics departments. I did for 20 years, international trade, finance, introductory macro, stuff of that nature, graduate courses in macro. But basically, there's an absolute fundamental mistake. The 0.25 elasticity to import prices is based on assumed retail prices, and it's also nonsense in their discussion, and which in itself is questionable. but they're not looking at retail prices in their formula. They're in fact looking at import price elasticity, which really should be close to 1 by definition. And hence, what they're imposing is twice as high levels of tariffs, otherwise with the assumption of that number, or 4 times higher if you take away their kind division by 0.2. Any undergraduate student knows that if you're trying to look at the impact of trade on the GDP, you need to include services. Guess what? Ignore it. So it's not even included in the gap between exports and imports, basically. You take the South Africa case, which I looked at. South Africa puts a tariff actually of 7.5%. So based on that Rose Garden presentation by their dear president, they should be assessed a tariff of 3.75%. No, so and then if you begin to actually say, okay, if we include the service deficit that South Africa runs with the United States, the tariff rate should be 21%. Now, South Africa basically also, the other part of the fine print is in the South Africa case, they left out tariffs on some key minerals and metals that have to be imported into the United States. So in fact, 40% of the trade with between South Africa and the United States is excluded. And then South Africa says, we're not going to bother retaliating, because what we're going to do is we're going to be punishing our local industries or importing vital elements for the United States. So we're not going to retaliate on the tariffs, right? That's really not worth it. The cost will be much worse than the others. Now, in the days that I used to teach my undergraduate international trade courses, basically, I'd always say, imports and exports are really complicated the way people choose them. And tariffs is a very, very small part of it, basically. So in the case of a poor country like Lesotho, why is Lesotho running a huge goods trade deficit with the United States? It's kind of simple. It's an institutional phenomenon. One is they have AGOA, and they built up a labor-intensive textile manufacturing effort there and exported to the United States. So it came from an institution the United States created. And the second part of why they're not importing from the United States is because they're too poor. They can't really afford much coming from the United States, and as a result, they run a deficit. So and hence they're being punished for being poor, and they're being punished for an institutional arrangement put in place by the United States itself. This is the madness of it. So from the macro perspective, what's going on here? We know that U.S. trade deficit is linked to large government deficits, which really contribute to the U.S. ability to consume more than it's producing. They've been doing it for decades. And it really has to do with the great, as they call it, the great privilege of the dollar, in which you basically can run trade deficits. You can run these deficits for years, as long as people are willing to hold on to your currency. It's a privilege of having the hegemonic currency, basically. And so it has permitted the United States to have a higher standard of living than they otherwise would without having this enormous privilege of the dollar. So despite the nonsense that comes from Trump's mouth on tariffs, that it's all going to be in the other country, it's a tax on the consumption of the American population. Nobody can really predict whether it will change the underlying macroeconomics, basically. And I'm an economist for years. I said tariffs can be a very useful industrial tool. It's got to be carefully calculated to understand the impact. It should be done for a limited time, and it should be done with other measures in support. Absolutely none of that is embedded in the tariffs that Trump has put in place, basically. And what is certain about these tariffs is that it will lead with retaliation, as China's already done, leading to lower economic growth, greater multipolarity, and as the U.S. diminishes its role in global trade. But I want to now kind of talk about a key area really pertinent to Africa, which is the issue of currencies, financial flows. So why financial flows, and what are they? And my classes, I go through a great definition of what they are and everything, but kind of to summarize very rapidly, total official flows incorporate the sum of concessional assistance and non-concessional flows in developing countries. It includes export credits, which have a primarily commercial motive, private flows that are defined as financial flows at market terms, finance out of private resource, including changes in the holding of private long-term assets, held by residents, reporting country sovereign bonds, private grants, grants by non-government organizations, net subsidies received by the official sector. Private capital flows widely divided into foreign direct investment, portfolio equity, remittances sent home by migrants, and private sector borrowing. And we'll talk a lot about how those have changed over time and how it's affected African countries. Financial flows really are a key way in which Africa connects to the rest of the world. Though goods and people moving out of the continent, the financial flows really associated with their movements are really important to African economies. We'll talk about. What has been incredibly important in Africa and has shaped the economic structures of African economy, leading to extreme disarticulation since 1980, when a large demobilization of the constraints of those flows. It really opened the African economies through structural adjustment based on some very problematic theory, including open account liberalization, which I'll go over briefly into. I don't have a lot of time to get into the theory behind it. And it opened up the economy, and it pushed the economy even further into disarticulation, where you have this massive, basically, division and divide between what Africa consumes and what Africa produces. And basically, all financial flows are dominated in currencies, and hence understanding the nature of currencies, the institutional power is really central for understanding the comparative global dominance in the world and the subservience that is underneath it. So the key characteristic, as many of you know, of the global financial system, the key architecture is the hierarchy of currencies. And it really helps to define your standing in the global order. Roughly speaking, there's many ways to divide it up. There's a kind of hegemonic currency, the US dollar, major strong currencies, the yen and the euro, minor strong currencies, the renminbi, the Mexican peso. See, I put it up in that category. And then the weak currencies, the Argentinian peso, and then the junk currencies like many African currencies. So understanding the power configurations that are really embedded in this financial architecture is really key to understanding what we have now in Africa, which is another major debt crisis. And as the work of Zajon recently, an article put it, and others have written about this for a long time, debt really is a social relationship marked by asymmetrical material and power differentials between debtors and lenders. As he argues, political attempts to organize some kind of united front against debt, basically with the agenda of trying to understand capitalist development as policies, lacking concern basically for the ontology of debt and its relational consequence within global capitalism, reinforces the discursive normalization of the egregious way in which Africa is integrated into the global financial system. And to really understand that history and that dynamic and that embeddedness, one really has to understand how it interfaces with the global financial system. So money, as we know, is an institutional construct. It has four functions: a store of value, a medium exchange, a unit of account, and a standard of deferred payment. The United States is really at the top of this hierarchy, due largely to its capacity to fulfill those four functions. But it should be absolutely emphasized that there's nothing natural about this. It was a deliberate political effort. Some mainstream economists might argue, well, the US deserves this in this rule, but it really was a deliberate effort by the United States, which used its power after World War II to institutionalize the hegemonic position of the US dollar through the Bretton Woods system, really aimed at buttressing its movement towards unipolarity. It provides enormous advantage. Even Trump knows this, right? Even though he's undermining the currency in some ways, his famous comment, quoted by many now, kind of sums it up. We require a commitment from those countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs. Well, some countries are already approaching that, right? And should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. Well, Polly has, I think, one of the better articles on understanding the history of how this came about. the dollar hegemony under the Bretton Woods era from 1946 to 71, dollar distress from 71 to 80, and really what was the new era of the building, largely with neoliberal policies, the enormous reinvention, regeneration of the hegemony of the U.S. dollar after 1980, which really was generating by these neoliberal policies and increasing the power of finance capital. We know, and I can't spend a lot of time on this, that dollar hegemony was built into the design, from the beginning of Bretton Woods. The very famous. I've read a lot of these papers at the Bretton Woods meetings of the minutes and everything. Heavily pushed back by Keynes, who understood the enormous problematic nature of actually then creating a dollar-based global economy. The U.S. took full advantage of the system. They didn't play by the rules that they set. I don't know if your previous previous secretary took his girlfriend to look at Fort Knox. Well, Fort Knox was the basis of the Bretton Woods system, right? Basically, what happened was, the U.S. had agreed to basically not put more money out in the world unless they had enough in the reserve with $35 an ounce of gold, basically. And what it did is, though, the U.S. used the advantage, as Keynes so predicted, that expanded U.S. global corporations financed huge overseas military operations and really flooded the world with dollars. So that by the 1950s, where you had a ratio of $4 outstanding for every dollar, $4 of gold at $35 an ounce for every outstanding dollar, it had reversed by the early 1970s of 1 to 4. And that's when de Gaulle said, I'm sitting all this dollars, give me gold. And Nixon said, go to hell, you're not getting our gold. And that was the end of the convertibility to gold. It was a period of enormous distress. Bergsten, 1987, neoclassical economists argued it was the end of the dollar hegemony because of the massive deficits, but it really was a tectonic shift, in the rebuilding of the hegemony of the U.S. dollar over this period of time. And it was an attempt to kind of reconstruction. Following the revoking convertibility, foreign banks purchased T-bills instead of gold, which was effectively financed the U.S. deficit, including the U.S. military ventures. The U.S. basically then began issuing debt in its own currency, and you can't default. I mean, basically, if you think about it, you could have an unwillingness to hold U.S. bonds, which could lead to higher interest rate. You could have a currency depreciation, but really neither threatened the hegemony of the dollar once it was locked in. In 1974, the U.S. kind of had a military for dollar agreement with the House of Saudi, which Saudi said all transactions in oil are now in gold, in dollars. In return, we're going to maintain our power in Saudi Arabia. Petrodollars then were deposited and became the U.S. the basis for the lending in Latin America and the crisis in Latin America, which you all know about with the debt crisis. And it really expanded the U.S. dollar as a debt server, debt device, and a standard of deferred payment. In addition, there was the demobilization of the constraints of holding dollars in Europe, which then and the abolishing of exchange controls by Thatcher, allowing people then to begin in Europe overseas to accumulate dollars. The high interest of the Volcker period also encouraged low inflation of strong dollar at the expense of employment and labor unions. And following that, U.S. basically then began its transformation with a low economy, low taxation rate, deregulation, anti-labor policies, attracting capital and providing motivation for even bringing more dollars into the world, continuing a strong dollar approach. And it really became the center of global capitalism, the center of global financing, and the holding of dollars. Neoliberal policies shifted income from labor to capital while favoring finance. And monetary policy encouraged asset inflation, drawing finance capital into the country. Neoliberalism increased global trade, opened up countries to FDI and other financial flows, generated global production networks, and moved manufacturing offshore, putting further pressure on wages and wage share. So rising global health then helped to kind of feed this dynamics of financialization and the hegemony of the US dollar. And what is the extraordinary growth and concentration of wealth in dollars in the world, as we've watched, as we have now increasingly good data documenting the degree of concentration of wealth. And multiple authors have shown the continued domination of the dollar. Basically, a lot of calls that dollar hegemony is disappearing. Even look at the latest data, it hasn't really changed very much. But US dollar share of reserves, cross-border banking claims, banking liabilities, currency debt, issue relative US share of GDP all grew and were higher as high as 2.6, 2.75 from 2015 onwards. The average share of exports between 1990 and 2019 was 96.3%, 74% Asia and Africa, 79.1% in the rest of the world. And so, in essence, total international trade is well over 50% in dollars if we look at export and import still. Only European transactions fell below that. So why does any of this matter? It explains really the evolution of the dollar hegemony, but the question also is we have to understand how that hegemony is played out for those that are at the bottom of the currency hierarchy. And so we have to also talk about hegemony and subordination. The US basically was very much freed from the balance of payments constraint, particularly after the end of Bretton Woods, and hence macroeconomic priorities were generally not impeded by any external consequences. There was massive seigniorage created because of the ability to virtually create dollars for free, and the holding of these trillions of dollars, which were costless to produce, as I said. The high demand for US assets then also lowered interest rates and dramatically increased US wealth. In the opposite direction, basically, the Accord with Saudi Arabia committed the price of oil, as did many other commodities, into US dollars. But it's also important to go beyond the hegemonic side to look at the subordination side. This is where we can begin to talk about the African position. We know that the issue of power, even in finance, is interlinked with other dimensions of power, economic, political, and military. And the exercise of state power is really paramount, as is at the core of the system. Currency then, which is state issued, really gives you a standing in the international financial system. Power, though, is relative. The rise in power of one leads to an increase in dollar hegemony, diminishes the power and the rest of the world, exacerbating subordination. Economic power basically is also key to determining which countries will be hegemonic. The size of the country is important, but other really important dimensions are central, technological advantage, productivity, and that in itself is not enough to understand the position of the United States. We also have to have the political will to take on the role of the hegemonic currency, basically, which was largely absent in the war period by the United States, as many authors have pointed out. That changed after World War II with the decline of the sterling and the British Empire, and the US eager to extend its corporate power globally. Two other strategic elements I can't get into much time was the military dominance and the rise of its international political power. The US was the leader of the neoliberal order, the liberal order. You can see that in the way institutions from the World Bank, the IMF, and even the GATT and then the WTO, which were incredibly dominated by the United States and often written to the rules in line with the priorities of the United States. US MNCs basically began to dominate after World War II, played a key role in both accessing US government as an avenue of US government access to overseas countries. All these elements begin to interact, as I suggested. But the key to justify the hegemonic position of the US is these organizations, like the WTO, did the incredibly important thing with the Accord in 1995, of expanding the WTO intellectual property rights, giving the United States 20 years of protection in property rights, which was huge in terms of its imposition on the world. So power dynamics underlying the strengthening of military, economic, political position of the US weakens those that are at the very bottom. The flip side of subordination is also domination, inferiority, and subjugation. The impact basically of the neoliberal policies dramatically changed the nature of the structures of African economies becoming increasingly more commodity dependent. And it led to a kind of a cycle of boom and bust in these economies, and with it associated debt crisis. Every time delivering these countries into the arms of the International Monetary Fund, which was there to actually then and sometimes maintain the hegemony of the United States and the global hierarchy of currencies. We look very briefly at the IMF. The IMF has always had built in from the beginning, the US was given veto power with a share above 15% from the beginning, and always above 15% because no major changes in the IMF can occur without at least 85% of the vote. And so that has kept that position of directing the power of the IMF. The fund basically, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through this, I'm kind of running out of time. It was a quota system initially. You were allowed to take up 25% per annum of your currency deposit, up to 125% of lending. The only thing that was there in the beginning were graduate charges. They started using conditionality, but conditionality really became widespread when the IMF's credit facilities expanded with standby agreements in 1952. And gradually what happened then is the resources and the size and the impact of the IMF began to expand. With the end of the Bretton Woods period, the IMF became kind of the lender of last resort, largely for poor countries with a huge impact on Africa. From the beginning, they used the kind of anti-inflationary policies, their stabilization analysis, formalized by Pollack in the so-called financial programming model. Typically 12 to 18 months, 3.5, 5 years. Credit was allocated in tranches, basically. And they used a kind of focus, a kind of monetarist type approach, maintaining fixed exchange rate by adjusting the domestic absorption capacity to deal with balance of payments crisis, invariably focusing on reducing domestic absorption by cutting back on government spending. And what you had then as a period of time was a huge expansion in the post-Cold War period in which the US military triumphed, and the competition, which created policy space when you had the Cold War, disappeared. And it dramatically reduced the policy space of African countries, forcing them to accept what was then the institutionalization of neoliberal conditionality into the IMF and the World Bank. It strengthened the dollar hegemony, weakened African economies, and created this dependence on commodity exports. And what ended up happening, of course, was that every time the commodities went south, Africa was into a debt crisis and was forced then to get loans from the International Monetary Fund, which invariably is still stuck on this absurd world of pro-cyclical policies, both fiscal and monetary levels. So in essence, you go to the IMF, you're always worse off economically, even in the economic research of the IMF. So poor countries go to great lengths in Africa to avoid the International Monetary Fund. One of the things is building up very large international reserves, which could hypothetically be used to transform economies, but it sits in accounts. I remember having a huge shouting match with the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria saying, during the U.S. war, in Iraq, and I said, why they're sitting on tens of billions of dollars reserves buying U.S. Treasury bills? I said, why are you financing U.S. war in the Middle East? And we had this big spitting match. They had guards there. I thought they were going to shoot me, but at a meeting in Addison, and he just said, oh, well, we can't bring it back. He has this very neoliberal notion. It's going to be inflationary, blah, blah, blah. And they bought into the IMF system. So it creates what I call a vicious cycle of commodity dependence, because being dependent on commodity creates the conditions that keep you dependent on commodities, because you can't really use that when you have that opportunities. And it electively drives African countries back into the IMF and tends to reproduce the financial subordination, basically at the same time holding reserves actually then empowers the United States when it's held in dollars. And not really much has changed over this period of time. And so the system of subordination feeds into the system of hegemony. What happens is this gross financial system, the system basically reduces policy space, constraints sovereignty, shapes social, political, economic structures of African economies. And so what we've seen is now, once again, the commodity prices peaking around 2015 in Africa. They're going south. At the same time, Africa gets hit with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian war, and inevitably pushes Africa back into another debt crisis. I don't want to go through a lot of it. I have the data here. If I had time, I'd go through the history of lending. I kind of follow this stuff basically. But what you had, just to summarize, was these two slides, is you went from only 12 loans for the IMF in 2014, all the way through with these no financial devices. What you ended up having was something in the area of 37 countries getting loans from the IMF from Africa. So it put African countries back in to the hands of the IMF and the neoliberal conditionality, basically enhancing this structural disarticulation. So we can look at the history of, I have probably about 15 more minutes, right, or so? Okay. So we'll look at the history of what has happened. And I gathered data to see where the financial flows are and the degree of policy space within that financial flows. So you look at the period of 1990, I look at the ratio of, basically FDI and remittances relative to ODA, right? Overseas development aid. The overseas development aid, as I've written extensively on the history of structural adjustment, both bilateral and multilateral aid worked together in a cartel that ensured Africa was forced to take these structural adjustment neoliberal policies. And so if you look at the ratio of remittances and FDI relative to overseas development aid in 1990, it was 0.11. These countries, if you wanted to get access to vital imports in a crisis, you had to go to official aid. And with official aid, the only thing you could accept was neoliberal conditionality. You had no choice. I remember way back in my in the 1980s when I spent 2 years in Tanzania teaching in the 80s. I remember looking at the IMF conditionality standby agreements in Mozambique and Tanzania. They were virtually the same, and all of them had the same conditionality. There was a big move I wrote a book on Tanzania and IMF. Tanzania was one of the last holdouts, and it was incredibly important to demonstrate to Africa you have no choice. And so they eventually broke Tanzania. They had to then join with the International Monetary Fund and sign an agreement basically in 1986. And so you can see, though, you have more flexibility, and you see the huge growth in part because of the crisis in African countries, massive outflow of people. Some people would say, oh, it's a celebration. Look at all these Africans sending money back to Africa. No. It's incredibly depressing. It's a moment of crisis because you can't survive in Africa. You go off and you increase, and you have this huge role of huge growth of remittances. So you can see going from a ratio of 0.11, African countries increasingly rely on remittances of FDI. It gives them some more policy space. And the numbers, peaking around 2015 at roughly 2 to 1. So what happens over this period is enormous marginalization of official aid. And you can see some changes. I wrote a paper on how African countries, as a result, was able to actually have fiscal expansion during the 2008 crisis because they didn't have to rely on the IMF pro-cyclical policies. And so they actually had anti-cyclical policies during that period of time, which allowed higher levels of growth until we had the collapse in 2015 of international commodity prices. And so you can see it provided a lot of flexibility, both remittances and with FDI. But the problem with FDI, yes, it does provide income coming in, but it has a very problematic structural impact on African countries. What you have basically is huge growth. FDI is always very small in Africa relative to developing countries. So often in the range of 2.5 to roughly 7%. It shrunk as Africa moved, as the world moved away from resources, became more information technology intensive. At the time that that World Bank is saying to Africa, oh, you don't really need a higher education. Your comparative advantage. I read and wrote about this. It was insanity that they told Africa you don't really need much education. They cut back their universities. And so when information technology were the basis of the global expansion in the 90s, Africa wasn't participating. You had a huge crisis in the universities, which was deliberately put in African countries. And it meant higher and higher reliance as you cut back on spending on social services, on infrastructure, on education. It led to higher and higher erosion of your capacity to attract FDI in anything other than resource expansion. So you had the huge law of growth and removement particularly after the crisis coming from the Iraqi war, a huge increase in African oil as they began to diversify the number of the sources of oil into Africa away from the Middle East. And so the huge expansion, much of it in FDI, was to countries which were oil producing. By 2000, 2008, more than 60% of the increase of FDI, which went from 2.5 to 7% of developing country FDI, was basically in the two countries, big oil producers, Angola and Nigeria. You had more producers coming online over that period, partly with FDI and gas and oil. So in these oil producing countries, by 2016, 70% of all the FDI in sub-Saharan Africa going to oil producing countries, basically. So it kind of enhanced the resource side of Africa and have to enhance that disarticulation where Africa is increasingly producing raw materials and producing oil and gas, as opposed to actually diversifying the economy. The other element, which I can very briefly go into, is sovereign debt, which became available in 2006, in part because of the huge rise in interest rates. It led to, of course, the junk bond mortgage crisis in the United States. But you also had a situation where all of a sudden the HIPAA countries could get access to sovereign debt. I don't want to go through it in a great amount of detail. The interest rates were ridiculous high. There was during the COVID, the beginning of the debt crisis, when Zambia defaulted on sovereign debt in 2020. The Africa had very little presence, but by 2024, they were starting getting access, but at ridiculous high interest rates. Kenya floated a sovereign debt issue at 10.375%. I mean, that's usurious if you think about these interest rates, basically. And so all very high interest rates during this period of time. And so Africa then paid huge amounts on very high interest rates, incredibly pricey, helping to contribute to the current debt crisis. And you can see just the very high interest rate levels over time that Africa was paying. And then we did a econometric study and said, okay, is it justified? I did with Michael Olabisi. I don't want to talk about it, but basically we showed it was not justified. You cannot use the fundamentals that they say markets are determined by to explain how Africa is paying its interest rates. In our first study, 2006, 2014, we saw roughly 2.9 percentage points overpayment, which could not be explained, which leading to billions and billions of dollars. We recently published an article a couple of months ago looking at the data all the way through 2022, and also saw something like $5 billion of overpayment, which could not be covered. So why do Africans agree to do this? Because it provides dollars without neoliberal conditionality. There's the fungibility of that, basically. But it ultimately leads to this financial vulnerability at a very high rate and the debt crisis, once again pushing the African countries into the arms of the International Monetary Fund. So I have a few more minutes to talk about it. So this just gives you the enormous structure of African economies. You can see primary commodity overwhelmingly from 87 through something like 90% of 92% of exports. This is ridiculous. This is back to colonial times when you had this structure. The complete deindustrialization economy. I can say I predicted this in an article in 1992 that adjustment would deindustrialize, and it did. And you can see the huge rise of exports of fuels over this period of time, hitting all the way up to 71% in 2008. And a lot of it is driven by the prices. Manufacturing goods really falling most years well below 10%. And you can look at Southeast Asia. It's the flip side. 10, 12, 13% in commodities, and overwhelming in manufacturing goods. We could get into it, but it makes a huge difference in the standard of living. African countries had roughly had a higher real per capita income in dollars in 1970 than Southeast Asia, and by 2020 it was a ratio of 4-1. So what you do has huge consequences. The idea of static comparative advantage of this nonsense that they teach in economics that you should produce what you can produce comparatively is absurd. As I used to say, any 5-year-old knows you earn a lot more money, basically being a really lousy lawyer than you do being the best shoe shine boy or girl in the world. What you're in and the business you're in has huge consequences to your standard of living. And this just gives us data on UNCTAD on the huge price shock. So let me try to conclude. I have a few more minutes just to try to conclude and open up the questions. So sub-Saharan Africa is once again in a debt crisis. Debt to exports exceeded more than 200% in 2020. Numbers we have not seen for 20 years, since before the HIPC and Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, between 1996 and 2005. We now have something like 20 countries that are either in debt sustainability, either in distress or very high risk for debt distress. This gives us kind of the breakdown of where the sources are coming from. And you can see that it's multiple sources. You've got, a huge growth of what is actually, of course, the sovereign bond debt issue, bilateral debt across the board. And basically what you have here is, so the private debt, the light green, is the huge growth in the sovereign debt and other forms of private capital. And then growth in other cases, slow growth in comparative bilateral growth in aid, and of course, large expansion more recently in multilateral aid. And so both Ghana and Zambia defaulted. We've written a paper just showing the nonsense of the argument I'm one of these crazy self-destructive people that reads IMF reports cover to cover, and it's just, they're still in this world that it's all the cause of African countries. We wrote an article and recently an op-ed on this in the case of Zambia. In Ghana's case, they seem to have largely done everything that orthodoxy told them to do. At one point, the World Bank said, Ghana, the rising growth star and beacon of hope in West Africa. Well, then Ghana defaulted, got into a major debt crisis. And really, it's symptomatic of the deeper malaise of the core of the international financial architecture of the 21st century, basically. And obviously, there's a great need to move away from dollar hegemony towards a much greater financial multipolarity world, which is an enormous challenge. One of the few papers that actually goes in, one of my favorite economists, the institutional economist, Kaltenbrunner, goes out and does this crazy things and actually goes interviews central bankers and people working in financial markets and say, how are these things operating? And one of the problems, and there was this whole movement towards full capital account liberalization, based on this nonsensical neoclassical theory that countries are poor, they have a lower, they have basically Africa and others have based on your endowments, your comparative prices of capital are high, prices of labor are low. And so it should attract capital from those where there's a low return in capital developed countries into the developing countries. And that means you should open up your accounts, let the capital come, because you'll have the gain, they'll get a higher return, and it'll lead to higher capitalization. Biggest problem was that Africa, the movement was the opposite direction from Africa. And so then you had this whole Lucas paradox nonsense in the literature. I've written on this, trying to explain it in neoclassical economics, but it's really been incredibly problematic. It's led, as I've shown, in the case of Zambia and Ghana, the openness of the capital account, the ability to buy bonds locally by foreigners helped to contribute to the outflow, the collapse of the currency and the debt crisis, where they could no longer service the debt. In Uganda, the three international banks control 90% of the foreign exchange market. There's very little liquidity in foreign exchange markets, enormous amounts of power. Bankers don't use the currency for economic reasons. They use it simply for defense purposes, heavily aimed at accumulating foreign exchange, basically, and putting it into reserves. There was always a tendency when they interviewed these bankers, they're all very, and I've written on this, incredibly neoclassical in their view, very neoliberal in their view, pushing greater trade and financial liberalization on understanding the impact that it has, constant attempts to accumulate hard currency. And no evidence that they were thinking outside the box, such as drawing on the kind of economic theory that Alicia and I use, institutional economic theory. But there is some hope. And let me talk a bit about, in closing, the next couple of minutes, some of the new attempts. So the ability to break out of the system really requires an alternative set of economic constructs that understands as the source of power that perpetuates the system and identifies the power that can be contested. Along these lines, I recommend the work of Eileen Grable, who draws on the idea of the great institutional economist Albert Hirschman about productive incoherence. So embedded in the increasingly messy world of South-South monetary and financial relations, we have institutional innovations that appear incoherent but do provide scope for institutional experimentation. And it leads to what Hirschman called possibilism, increasing the number of ways in which can be visualized and emulated with new institutional experimentation and growing, increasing linkages between institutions. She provides some examples worldwide, but then notes that neither the Asia nor the global crisis had any major catalytic effect on reserves pooling and project financial institutions on the African continent. Others have used this framework to understand experimentation. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I recommend looking at the Fritz and all article on the experimentations with the payment system of local currency, Sistema de Repagos on Moneda between Mercosur countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. It had minimal impact, but it was an attempt to actually then in these central banks process transactions for small players in foreign currencies, all being settled in basically hard currencies rapidly at the end of the day. It had a moderate effect, but it's been mostly through experimentation. There's also some new transactions being done basically under multiple countries such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, etc. So there's some experimentation going on now within the BRICS system on transactions electronically through central banks. But I want to close with a little bit of a discussion of a new system that's just popped up in Africa, basically. So one step to direction is the creation now of PAPs by the African Export Bank, which is the most progressive of the multilateral banks on the continent. It was a pilot phase 2022. 15 central banks now have signed on with 150 commercial banks to a system aimed at operationalizing it by the end of 2025 this year. It's based on a system of instant payments, pre-funding, and net settlements. Originator purchasing an item in another country issues payment instructions to the bank in their home country, which is sent to PAPS, which checks it out and forwards it to the receiving bank, who clears the funds, the recipient. It requires pre-funding, which is problematic and and challenging, particularly for poor participants. And it needs you need settlement accounts with a real-time gross settlement system with central banks, which then act as intermediaries with those settlement accounts. For those without settlement accounts, they can also use those with settlement accounts. The idea is 24-hour transactions and settling of net positions, and then PAPS then goes to the Export-Import Bank, which has accounts of all the African countries in hard currency, and then does any netting out with hard currency exchanges. So it does speed up trade. It does potentially cut down on transaction costs. It does lead to a potential reduction in the use of the hard currency in the US dollar, which is probably the biggest threat to the hegemony of the dollar now. But the biggest problem in Africa is the structural nature of production. You can't look at spheres independently. If you actually look at the data, only 16% of total trade in Africa is between other African countries. So one has to, when thinking about multipolarity, one needs to be conceptualized beyond the sphere by sphere focus to think about the interaction between the spheres. And basically, one needs, in my opinion, and I've written about, one needs kind of thinking about a continent-wide institution that began to put in industrial policy, encouraging value chain manufacturing within Africa and expanding it eventually to the global south. Along these lines, Malcolm Alabisi and myself, a Nigerian-based economist at Michigan State, have written a paper proposing the creation of an African green bank, which would facilitate the generation of green energy and manufacturing supply chain on the continent. At least I heard this paper at the economic meetings in January. Perhaps the Trump's tariffs, just in closing, will be a wake-up call and begin to generate the challenging of these hegemonic forces of the status quo, and perhaps begin to move to a multipolar system that can focus on and expand what is the common existential challenge that we face. This is a moment, it's a moment of crisis, a moment of transformation. And like every good moment, we need to crisis, we need to use it for productive purposes. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Howard, for your very insightful presentation. I have a lot of questions. I'm only going to ask you one because I want to give also the opportunity to the public and to people who are following us in the social media. I was thinking, like 2 months ago, we held a colloquium here about the financial problematic, global problematics, and the role of global South societies in this context. And I think after hearing you that the Trump administration, what is provoking is an exacerbation of this financial situation in regions like Africa or Latin America. And when I was following your presentation, you clearly highlighted the 70s, when the dollar was being hegemony was being questioned, and how this started with all the structural adjustment programs everywhere. No, I think what is has been under assault on all these years since the 70s is the idea of the welfare state in all the world. But in Western Europe and the US, the welfare state was set up, and there was a lot of benefits and rights for American and European population. But the state in Africa or the state in Latin America has never had the capacity to adapt to these structural adjustment measures. I would like to ask you, why do you think that still the impact? I think the impact here in Latin America has been less bad. I don't know how you say that. Less destroying than in Africa. What are the factors that you think that here in Latin America the structural adjustment reforms haven't had this impact, this negative impact? They have had negative impact, but not as much as in Africa. And also, you during your presentation, you presented financial flows as the way, this continent, these societies are linked to the world. And I would like to ask you, I know that maybe the answer is going to be a highly utopian, idealistic answer, but how can we reverse this situation? How can we assess, or how can supply chains, value chains can be reversed in order to bring much value to the resource extreme of the chain? Because we know that African continent is rich in strategic minerals and resources, and that's the primary source of their economy. You proved that they have no industrial capacity, not manufacturing capacity. So is there a way maybe we can reverse the way we envision supply chains, value chains? I don't know if it's possible. Another comment on your presentation, I think that this dependency context of African societies is not traceable to the 70s or even to the colonial period. I think that this structure of dependency goes back to the slave trade with this triangular model, when the basis for dependency were set up, and I think that hasn't changed a lot since those centuries. So I don't know really which is the way out for Africa in this hegemony of financial economy controlled by the US. And basically, that's my question. How can you go out of this vicious cycle that we have talked a lot about of this commodity dependence of African societies, African countries? And also, if you can explain us why during the second decade of the century, when the economist was very hopeful about the growth of African societies, where is this narrative of Africa rising now in this context of the Trump administration coming to power and financial power having ever more power over societies and states of Africa?
I go briefly so we can open up for other questions. Thanks for your good questions and comments. Basically, African countries had very problematic structures of import substitution that had a lot of trouble weathering structural adjustment. And it led to a situation where they were trying to use and develop industrialization in Africa based on the back of export taxes and earnings on the structures of the economy that were put in place by the colonial regime. You know, I'd argue that I wouldn't call continuity over the pre-colonial period to the colonial period. It was a lot of major transformations. Even if you look at the history of trade in West Africa, there was actually quite a robust handicraft manufacturing industry in Nigeria, you know, in places like Timbuktu and up in the north, in the west coast of Africa, you know, all the way down into Kano. And we have studies which actually shows that they were producing a lot of things, you know, cloths, and they're producing tools, and they were doing a lot of manufacturing, you know, and then it got opened up to the slave trade, and that, you know, had a dramatic impact. It created actually a movement which is often important, which is density of populations. Well, disperse the population because they didn't want to be picked up and thrown off into the Atlantic, you know. So there's no doubt the slave trade had a huge impact on deindustrialization and had a huge impact on the underlying capacities. Part of course, was problematic leadership. You know, Dahomey used to be a center of slave trade. Well, it had a very concentrated economy. It did some agriculture, but mostly it relied on arms and imports over that time, using that for purposes to maintain the political position. It's really a complicated history over this period of time. It wasn't so much continuity of dependency. There was new forms of transformation, but embedded in that was a history of power asymmetries, and it interacted with the rest of the world, which was very problematic, and particularly along the coastal areas. And that power asymmetries really carried on during the colonial period as well, where you really had an opportunity as the global economy became more modern, you know, needed high levels of education. Well, the colonial regimes didn't put anything into that. They didn't put into infrastructure. They didn't put in proper education or health systems, you know. And so Africa then at independence arrived at a huge deficit, everything that was needed. And there was heavy political pressure to rapidly do these things, you know. And, you know, you can go from country to country in interventions, you know, the Congo, the assassination of Lumumba, you know, undertaken probably by the Belgians and the CIA, nobody really knows. I mean, this huge outside disruption which occurred over time. You know, I could spend a long time lecturing on this, but so the bottom line is there was already embedded power symmetries in world relations, which was not as bad in Latin America, which had different histories. It had more and deeper industrialization, which actually could withstand some of these structural adjustment. African countries had very loose, very problematic institutions that were heavily dependent often on technology, which was not embedded but imported, which really, when they came in and they opened up these economies and got rid of protectionism and liberalized everything, it was devastating. When they privatized a lot of these state-controlled industries, and some of them were very viable, they were destroyed. They weren't privatized; they disappeared. So I would argue that the real impact, the full breadth and depth of structural adjustment as impact on Africa was in Africa and other parts of the world. It was hit by the most. They were the least resistant. to the ability to transform the economies. It was devastating for the economies. What I'd also say, which is extremely important, is that if you want to look to transformation, look to Asia. This is where they've used a different set of policies and have avoided the influence of the IMF and the World Bank and the outside institutions to pave their own way. You can take a look at the case of China. A couple of years ago, I highly recommend Isabel Weber's book on China. And basically, it's how China avoided neoliberal shock therapy. They created, and part of our argument and part of what I've written on is the institutionalization of neoclassical economics. And that was incredibly important because you have the ability to transform economies. But if the minds of these economists are caught in this kind of coloniality of thinking, which is basically neoclassical economics, which comes from the North, you don't come up with alternative ideas. I can't tell you the number of times of vicious fighting matches I've had with African economists, because there was a deliberate attempt, as I've written in a 2021 article in Economy and Society, it was a deliberate attempt to completely transform these economies in terms of the economic thinking from the beginning. And it was done by friends of mine that I used to teach with in Tanzania in the 80s. And they were neoclassical trained economists in the United States that came in through the African Economic Research Consortium to completely change the nature of thinking on the continent. So in the case of China, they never let these neoliberal, neoclassical economists, as they got trained, to have any impact on policy. They were smart enough, and they did their own way with their own thinking. And you look at Korea. Korea's industrialization wasn't run by neoclassical economists; it was run by engineers. It's the same in these other places. And so part of the problem is this, and it really was, and I need to write another paper on it. It was a deliberate attempt by the World Bank and others. Same thing in East Asia, where they handed we have Russia today because of the madness of handing over privatization to oligarchs and creating a structure economically and politically. And now we have the kind of Putin fascism, that comes out of this oligarchic model. And so part of the issue is also we have to have a major transformation of economic thinking, and then towards that, and the final thing I'll say is towards that, I'm working with French-trained economists in Lungosila, and we're working with Ideas to build a new organization called IDEN, Ideas Africa Network. We'll be having a launch conference in the fall, and it really is to try to retrain economists to heterodox economics. Really is being open-minded and saying we need to really open our ideas to, it's kind of like physics saying, the only thing in the world is Newtonian physics. Let's forget about quantum physics. And so it's just a huge narrowing over time of neoclassical economics, which has been so devastating because it's not just utopia. It's actually understanding how history has worked and using history as a mechanism of education and understanding of how to begin to transform these economies. The ability is there. The space is there. I used to hear, well, WTO, they're not going to allow you to do these industrial policy. There's still lots of things you could do. At one point, there wasn't a single African country taken to the WTO court. And I said, why not push it? But the key really is rethinking. And it's not just in the academic of economics departments, and it's worldwide, even here in Mexico, that you need to open your minds. It also runs all the way through this decades of teaching people that are newspaper writers, and people working in Ministry of Trade department, ministries of trade, people working basically, in the areas of ministries of finance. It's this huge, very pernicious set of theoretical weapons that does not see the possibilities of other things that can be done in the world, right? And that's what we've been pushing back on. On top of everything else, I'm just finishing up a book on something called on institutions of industrial policy in Africa. It's really utilizing a set of tools to understand how you build up the capacities for industrial policy to transform in Africa. I'll shut up there, but thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Howard, once again. And now we have time to pick up some questions from the audience and from the internet as well. So we can start here with the ones that are here present.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cesar Duarte. I'm a researcher here at the Institute. I would like to know your opinion about during the story that you presented us, the IMF is a key actor, right? Uh, with all these changes that are happening especially with the US, how do you see the IMF in the near future? Do you see that they are changing the role? Do you see like getting more in line with what the US is doing? I just want to know your opinion. Thank you.
Maybe take one or two other questions and then I'll answer.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. You make a big conference from of the financial system and what will happen since the post-war war. But I would like to say something. First of all, well, all this. Well, I will begin. Well, I think today during days we are living a very interesting moment, not only of a financial crisis, but a new structural change, a very deep structural change, because all these movements in the stock change market are taking us. I was yesterday trying to see how has been falling that Dow Jones. Comparing with the 2008, the 15th of September 28, even comparing with 5 years ago when the pandemic was whole, and today, and at least it was 30% that the Dow Jones was lowered. Well, in all of this, we have to change what's going. It's not only Trump. Of course, Trump is a little crazy, but we are living. Yes, well, it's we have to see more what's going in the structural of the world economy, and the thing is that we need to take the theory of Schumpeter, because we need a destruction, but a very huge destruction of how we are living right now, to take a new economy, to have also new profits. And in all this what we are seeing in the Wall Street, in the stock exchange and whatever, that where is Africa and where is China? And of course, most of the roots of all this change in Africa is all the colonial period, is all the fracture of the democracy, because they were independent, but at the same time, most of the leaders were imposed by the colony, especially by USA. That's why they killed Lubumba. I remember I was very little when they Lubumba, no? Yes, yes, I remember very well. And the other thing is all these. I think one of these countries, especially in the sub-Saharan, I think they are going to in all these structural change. The alternative right now is China, because that social debt that these countries have is done by the African investment, especially in trains, in ports, in roads, whatever. But the other thing is that we must read very careful Rosa Luxemburgo book, because for me, okay, it's China, but it's another imperialist movement of China, because most of the commodities for this deep structural economic change are in Africa. We need that digital economy. We need, of course, all the, for example, for the climate change, the panels, the 90% of the panels in the world are Chinese, because they are very, very cheap, no? So there's something, it's a new movement or new structural change that we are living. And well, I don't know, so that's just a comment. And even it is very interesting, the other thing that I presented now in the AFI all the institutional investors that are in these Chinese companies. And today, I just read early morning that there are 6 Japanese banks that they are not continue in the investment of the for the climate change. This is just terrible because the climate change is true. But with all these Trump ideas to return to the fossils, so I have so many. Sorry, I am very very confused about what we are reading. So I don't know what's your opinion.
Let me just quickly respond, Alicia, to you and the other question. Okay. Okay. Basically, we're meant to be confused, but we need to sit back and think about what's really going on. You know, the IMF is up for grabs. It would be crazy for the United States to blow up the IMF and because it's been so effective for them. You know, but who knows with these people? You know, at this point, I don't think it's going to happen. There has been discussions in Project 225 of maybe withdrawing from the IMF and the World Bank, but we'll see. It's played a very effective role for the United States. Would it change the nature of what the IMF is doing? I'm not sure, because the IMF is totally embedded with neoclassical economics. They really don't know much of anything else. You know, for years, they used to, in Africa, they'd have before they had such a widespread impact of the ARC, they used to bring in Ministry of Finance and central bank people to spend 6 months or a year at the IMF to get conditioned about IMF thinking. It's very much embedded. It hasn't really changed much. It's still really effective. And China really hasn't challenged it. You know, China has increased its percentage representation in IMF, but you know, in some ways, that gets into the Chinese Africa relationships. And I do a lot of reading on it. I do a lot of lecturing on it. I've written a couple of pieces on it. I'll probably do some more at some point. But what happened is China's kind of used the cover of neoliberalism in an effective manner. You know, they joined the WTO. They pretend they're going through these motions. They don't really challenge what the IMF is doing, you know, inside the IMF. It still continues to be very neoliberal and in its conditionality. And, you know, and it hasn't really changed the nature. You know, the reallocation of SDRs, you know, was done in a manner which had the potential to have a big impact on Africa. But they decided just to give it based upon what your quota already was. You know, and China went along with it, you know, and instead of kind of reallocating it, because I mean, the SDRs have a huge potential to move out of dollarization because it gives you then the ability to be able to access goods and services without having to rely on the dollars, just using your credits, you know, through the SDR. And so they look the other way. And they continue to perpetuate it. They might have done some of the lending of the poor countries, but it was a really wasted opportunity during the crisis to transform what the IMF was doing, because you do have then. Yeah, it was more like of the kind of thinking of Keynes on putting bankers in, having its own credit system in the world rather than relying on the US dollar. And so, but that moment's kind of come and gone. Will it change again? Who knows? Maybe there'd be a potential to push that a bit more if the US leaves. I don't think they're going to tolerate that, because you know very clearly that Trump will keep pushing dollar hegemony. China-Africa relationship, you know, it's complicated. I kind of put it somewhere in between the middles that call it pure imperialism and those that call it a great moment for development for Africa, because it has led to some positive developments infrastructurally, but it has not changed the nature of the structure of trade. If you actually look at the data, something like not over 90% of exports to from Africa to China is resources. It hasn't changed the nature of the structure. For Africa, it's been largely a way of bringing in a lot of cheap consumer goods, and it hasn't done a lot for manufacturing. They put very little. There was some movement, you know, I've spent some time in Ethiopia, of China saying, maybe this is where we'll set up some manufacturing. But they've actually done a minimal amount of, much of the FDI has been resource focused. There's some movement now into agriculture of Chinese FDI, but the overwhelming majority of it really has been mines, oil expansion, the kind of things that are already just kind of enhanced the structure of Africa. but it has built, I mean, look at, we do a lot of work on land issues in Tanzania the last 16 years. I worked with two anthropologists and a geographer studying the impact of property right formalization, Epidemiology, and its impact on the economies. We do a lot of socioeconomic surveys and studies, but we used to work in the area in Babati, which was in northern Tanzania, before the Chinese built the road, it would take us 6-7 hours to get there from Arusha flying in, and that now became 2 hours. That's a big difference. There is positive impacts infrastructurally, otherwise it's uneven, that China has provided for Africa. But it's also set an enormous amount, has not really changed the structure of the economies, and has now changed a lot of debt problems. And now we have a real problem with China being part of the common framework of the G20, in which the common framework basically, in which you have their participation for the first time. Before, remember, they always avoid the Paris Club in reorganizing debt. But that's very problematic because there's a fundamental divide between what their view of debt relief is and what the other view is. So they're not willing to take haircuts, and so the common framework has done really little to deal with the debt crisis so far in Africa. It's gone nowhere really, and for the most part, there's I think only 4 countries that participated in it. And then they're playing games. They say, well, really some of our money coming from the Export-Import Bank is private, so it really should be in the private group discussions of the common framework. And others say, no, it's official aid, and it's on the official side in kind of the Paris group, Paris Club. And so it's been difficult, and they're not really willing to adjust it. Their view always is a debt crisis is an issue of cash flow, and hence we need to change the terms rather than completely reduce it. And so it's China. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. China was sitting on what, $4 trillion of US dollars. They started recirculating some of that. Belt and Road Initiative was really an attempt to use it for purposes, build the kind of soft power strength of China in the world with some economic benefits. Africa was seen as an important source of resources into their manufacturing process. And that's when they started getting really upping their manufacturing, that's when they really built the relationship with Africa after 2000. And you can look at this data and it all kind of verifies this. And so basically, is China the hope here? It's problematic. Ultimately, I would argue that any change has to come from Africa by Africans. And that's really what we've been trying to build. I try to do all my writing and a lot of my research with Africans for many years, but again, they're hamstrung by the coloniality of their economic thinking. The ability to go beyond that, to understand what is possible. But there are, as I said, finally some progressive movements. I've made some progress, become good friends with the former chief economist, Export-Import Bank. I'm on their Journal of African Trade, on their editorial board. I try to bring more heterodox economic publishing into their mainstream journal, but it is a challenge. But ultimately, I'd argue it can't come from this room, it has to come from within Africa. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have still time for another question. Anybody in the audience?
Any questions from social media at all? Or?
From social media, any questions?
Hi. I'm not an economist undergraduate, so I don't know. So I don't know if this is going to be maybe an obvious question, but as I was listening to your lecture, I was thinking, is it possible to understand the tariffs that Trump is now imposing and the debt crisis that has been developing in Africa for a few years now, as maybe ways in which Africa can be kept as a kind of reservoir of natural goods that can be exported to other countries, keeping a low cost? That's my question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, Professor. I'm just letting you know one question from social media. It's in Spanish from Diana Saavedra. I will try to translate it. It's taking into account the current situation with President Trump. What should the nations of Latin America do? Is it time to get together between Latin America and Africa?
Okay, very quickly, just response to, thanks for the questions. Africa has a lot of resources, and that's what's really been developed over time. But if you were China and your FDI coming in, and let us say that you wanted to let's say exploit their nickel to build batteries for EVs, China would have said, no, you're not getting access to that unless you actually build the batteries here. And that's really what Africa has to do. You have the opportunity for leverage now. African countries, in my view, this is the opportunity to say you don't get access to the resources unless you build the factories here. And then you can get access to the resources. And it was the same thing with FDI in China. They said basically, we'll allow you to do manufacturing here for export. You'll pay higher taxes. But if you bring in co-ownership with the Chinese company, and we'll give you access to the Chinese market at lower tax rates. And it was simply contingent behavior that then forced the FDI in a manner which was much more developmental. But that hasn't happened, partly because of the impact of neoclassical economics. Oh, you can't do that. The states can't make decisions. You can't put these pressures on, which is very, very problematic. We have a moment now, I think, that where South-South economic relations have to be built. This is the opportunity. African countries have to be thinking about, as I said, internal supply chain value-added systems, but also linking to other South-South countries, including Latin America. You have hundreds of millions of people, huge markets, more than 1 billion people in Africa. You also hear a massive number of people here in Latin America. And I mean, it's time to build these South-South economic relationships, South-South financial systems. And some of it's been discussed, a lot has been rhetorical. Even BRICS talked about an alternative currency, has gone nowhere, BRICS is a bit problematic, having Saudi Arabia and Russia in with it. I mean, this is a bit iffy, that kind of relationships. But I think ultimately you need strength from within to be able to create relationships outside. And this is really which has to be done from both continents, coming together, building up a new institution, new relations, new trade agreements, and trying to do what I would argue is continent and ultimately South-related value chain production, that moves away from domination with North and United States. And I'll probably get arrested at the border for that comment, but when I return. But I'm speaking what I think is ultimately for the welfare of the vast majority of the world's population. Thanks.
Well, I thank you. We thank you a lot, Howard, for your presentation and answering all of our questions. I don't know if we still have time for another question. Yes, we still have time for another question, maybe. Onyeka, you don't want to? No? Okay. Anybody from social media? So okay, so we can take a break and
Okay, muchas gracias. I know I go on, and thank you for listening to me patiently.